Good morning. Welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm very happy to welcome you to this morning's important conversation about nonviolent civil resistance, or people power, and its role in peace building. And I know it'll be a great conversation because I've already started it with our three panelists, and I expect this to be a very lively exchange. Today's panel is the first live event associated with USIP's new Global Campus online training, and it's called Civil Resistance and the Dynamics of Nonviolent Movements. And the Global Campus, of course, is USIP's online learning platform, which provides online trainings, it hosts online events, and it builds communities around peace and conflict transformation. And to date, our Global Campus trainings have reached about 30,000 people around the world. So welcome to that community. And I'm very pleased to welcome today's panelists, who will bring a lot of expertise in their own personal experience to this. Kerri Kennedy, Manal, Omar, and Maria Stephan. Kerri Kennedy is the Associate General Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization that supports local peace building and social justice work around the world. Manal Omar is our own USIP Acting Vice President for the Middle East and Africa Center, and she has vast experience in both the policy and operational activities throughout the world, and especially in her region. And Maria Stephan is a Senior Policy Fellow also here at USIP, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she focuses on the role of nonviolent movements in transforming conflicts and advancing democratic development, and has written extensively on the topic we're discussing today. So the conversation that we're having today and this global online training comes at a really critical time. I mean, historically, we have seen nonviolent resistance movements have been twice as successful as armed struggles, even against very formidable foes and circumstances. We have seen empirically, and Maria has written about, the fact that nonviolent resistance contributes both to civil peace and to democracy. So we've seen recently the Arab Spring, the Maidan movement in Ukraine, pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, vibrant anti-corruption movements in places like India and Kenya. They all highlight the powerful role of people power. These movements are challenging unjust systems, they are challenging institutions, and they are opening the door to conflict being transformative, not violent. But at the same time, we're seeing a closing of civil space, a closing of the room for civil society to have that kind of a voice, with both governments and non-state actors clamping down on dissenters and prohibiting nonviolent assembly. So part of the conversation today will be on how to challenge this significant threat to international peace and security. How do we continue the power of people's voice at a time that we have the need greater than ever, but also closing space? On July 6th, the Global Campus launched the first chapter of this new training that explores the historical and theoretical foundations of civil resistance from ancient Greece to Gandhi's strategic application of civil resistance in South Africa and India, to the modern struggles in Poland, Argentina, Philippines, Serbia, and Tunisia. And we're joined today by many of our Global Campus training participants from around the world. They've been weighing in on the topic that we'll be exploring today. They've been weighing in all week, so we have some of their comments already, and they'll be feeding into today's discussion. We look forward, friends online, to hearing from you. So be at your keyboard. And for those who want more, please go to usipglobalcampus.org to join the training, which is free for a limited time, and stay tuned for online training events and conversation. If you are following us on Twitter, it's hashtag USIPGC. We've already released Chapter 1 of Civil Resistance and the Dynamics of Nonviolent Movements, which begins with a short documentary featuring Congressman John Lewis speaking about the first time that he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, our own country, the United States, is, thanks to nonviolent civil resistance, has gone through several very important historical transformations that enabled us to move into new stages, both through the civil rights, women's rights movement, the environmental movement. So this is salient as a global approach. So before we start the conversation, I'd like to invite you to watch a brief clip featuring Representative John Lewis, who is a man who's been a moral compass on Capitol Hill. He's been a great friend to U.S. Institute of Peace, and he really embodies the transformative power that is in civil nonviolent resistance. So please turn your attention to the clip, and then we'll begin the panel discussion.
Nonviolent action is a method of struggle that ordinary people have discovered and experimented with throughout history. In 1959, in a small church basement in Nashville, Tennessee, John Lewis started attending workshops on nonviolent action. He and all those who participated were introduced to the theory, history, and strategy of civil resistance. These workshops became the training grounds for what would become a generation of nonviolent activists fighting for civil rights throughout the United States.
In 1956, at the age of 16, with some of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we went down to the public library in the little town of Troy, Alabama, trying to get library cards, trying to check out some books. And we were told by the librarian that the library was for whites only, not for coloreds. When I finished high school in May of 1957, I wanted to attend a little college called Troy State College. It is now known as Troy University. Submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers. I told Dr. King I needed his help. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. I remember later, as I had gone off to school to Tennessee, Dr. King heard that I was there. He got back in touch and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So I met him in March of 1958. By this time, I'm 18 years old. And Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me. He became my hero. But a young man by the name of Jim Lawson, a great advocate of the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence, started conducting these nonviolent workshops. So every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m., a group of college students from Fisk University, Tennessee State, American Baptist College, Vanderbilt University, Meharry Medical School would go and study. We studied what Gandhi attempted to do, what he attempted to accomplish in South Africa, studied what he had accomplished in India. We studied Thoreau and civil disobedience. We studied the great religions of the world. We studied what Dr. King was all about.
John Lewis went on to become the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a member of the United States Congress.
Thank you. Representative Lewis, it's always very inspiring to hear him and to hear about his journey. And I'm reminded, and we were talking just in advance of the panel about how much work it is to successfully mount a nonviolent civil resistance campaign. And I have a number of questions for our panelists, but I'd love for them to also reflect on that and talk a little bit about how you prepare for a successful action or some nonviolent resistance, because it looks like just get a bunch of people and start walking down the street. It is a lot of work, to do well, it takes extraordinary training and preparation, which is, I think, at the heartbeat of what this course is about. And I'd also like to start us off with a question about, there's often a sense that some of the tactics of nonviolent resistance, the boycotts, the sit-ins, the demonstrations, are at odds with the traditional tools of peace building, the mediation, the negotiation, and sometimes those are seen as being in tension. So I'd love your thoughts on how you see those working together. Where are they in tension and where do they complement each other? So Maria, maybe you can kick us off on those two pieces.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Nancy, and I'd like to join her in welcoming you all to this first live event as part of our brand new online course called Civil Resistance and the Dynamics of Nonviolent Movements. And I'd first like to acknowledge my Global Campus star colleagues who've been putting together the course and will be facilitating throughout the year. So Darren Cambridge is here in the front row, Althea Middleton-Detzner, and there's a number of other colleagues, Leah. So why don't you guys stand up, just so folks know who you are. And I would say if people have any questions about how to get engaged in this pretty awesome multimedia online experience, these are the people to talk to after the event. So this is actually a great topic on how peacebuilding and nonviolent civil resistance intersect. I would say probably for too long these communities have operated in slightly separate orbits to the detriment of both, something I was talking with Kerri about earlier today. And so I think where we're in complete lockstep is the idea that conflict is often a very good thing. Violent conflict is generally a very bad thing. And you can actually transform conflicts using active nonviolent means. We should say at the outfront that the approaches taken in traditional peace building and nonviolent civil resistance tend to differ, but they're all part of an overarching conflict transformation approach and strategy. So as Nancy mentioned, whereas the traditional peace building approach looks at mitigating and de-escalating conflicts using techniques like dialogue and mediation and problem-solving activities, nonviolent civil resistance actually intensifies conflict, but in an attempt to shift power in a conflict so as to get to the point where you can have meaningful conflict resolution and negotiation. So civil resistance in a way ripens many conflicts for meaningful negotiation and conflict resolution. But just taking a bit of the data and research side of things. So some of you will be familiar with the research that I've conducted with Dr. Erica Chenoweth, who's based at the University of Denver, that looked at the efficacy of nonviolent resistance compared to armed struggles. And so we looked at 323 campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And these were campaigns that had at least 1,000 people involved against dictatorships and foreign occupation and campaigns for territorial self-determination. And we held constant all the things you would think matter in terms of determining the outcome of these campaigns, whether it was GDP or the military might of the opponent, the regime, socioeconomic divisions in the society. And we found, while holding these constant, that the nonviolent resistance campaigns, so people using these tactics of boycott, strike, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, outperformed their armed competitors, if you will, by a 2-to-1 ratio. So the nonviolent resistance succeeded about 54% of the time compared to 26% for violent campaigns. So that's a statistic that that people are starting to cite when it comes to comparing violent, nonviolent. But the interesting part of that research that is even more directly relevant to our conversation today looks at what happens to the society after the struggle when it's either violent or nonviolent. So just to show, I promise Kerri's going to have the more provocative pictures, but I'll show you some charts and graphs and data. So just quickly, this looks at the success rate over time and the fact that nonviolent resistance has been increasing in success over history. And so we look at how much more participation is involved in nonviolent movements compared to armed. The likelihood of security force defection is much higher in nonviolent movements compared to armed. But so this is, now these 2 points look at the effect of the resistance type on the society that follows. So we found a very strong positive correlation between nonviolent resistance movements and democratic consolidation after the transition happened. So the probability, according to our research, the probability that a country will be a democracy 5 years after a campaign ends is 57% amongst nonviolent movements, but less than 6% among successful violent campaigns. So that's a pretty striking finding. Not only that, we found that when looking at the relationship between resistance type and civil war recurrence, that as you can see, the likelihood of recurrence to civil war for violent campaigns is almost double compared to nonviolent campaigns. So there seems to be a very strong positive correlation between sort of nonviolent organizing and nonviolent resistance and the type of society that follows. And this is just suggests that, you know, the general peace building and positive peace, meaning peace that incorporates elements of justice, rule of law, human rights, go very well together. But I would say it's not always the case that these nonviolent mass movements lead to reconciliation and post-conflict stability, and that there's actually a tremendous amount we can learn from each other, meaning the peace building and conflict resolution worlds and the civil resistance. So I think this is a large part of our conversation today, sort of how practically they go together. And I think if there's one message that I would communicate at the beginning, is the idea that the peace building and the civil resistance approaches really should be seen as complementary and mutually reinforcing rather than at odds with each other.
Maria, thank you, and especially useful to have this data so that we're talking from some grounded place. And Kerri, how does AFSC see the connection of these two worlds?
Yeah, thank you. I have to say at AFSC, we were delighted by Maria's book because it validates what we've been seeing for 100 years. So it's nice to have that validation. Let me just ask, how many people are familiar with AFSC or Quakers in general? Good, yay, okay. So American Friends Service Committee is an organization that does peace building, civil resistance work, and what we call peacemaking. We're a Quaker organization that's been around for 100 years. We've been working to resist war, to resist slavery, to resist systemic oppression and injustice where we see it. Quakers, so many of you know Quakers for 350 years have been willing to be imprisoned, to suffer, and to die for their beliefs, for their moral convictions, and to fight for truth. And Alice Paul, who led the women's suffrage movement, was a Quaker who we lift up as a good example of this. So we think that they're absolutely symbiotic. You have to have civil resistance work, peacemaking, and peace building together. Sometimes our programs might focus on one or the other. We work best when there's elements of all three together in one strategy. So what we mean by Quaker peacemaking is convening. So we bring people together. We talk to all people on all sides of the issue. Quakers believe that there is light in everybody, or there is God in everybody. So if you truly believe that there is God in everybody, you have to talk to everybody. You have to talk to disaffected communities. You have to look for common ground. And that is a guiding principle for all of our work. So we bring people together, we mediate, we negotiate. We also look for root causes, what we would call peace building. So we do programs like income generating activity. In Guatemala, we do programs where we're looking for youth to reclaim public spaces that have been taken over by narco-terrorists or violent gangs. So we're doing this mediating work, we're doing this peace building work. We also are supporting movements. So we know that sometimes people have to organize. And we, as an organization, think that it is amazingly brave and courageous for both individuals and for organizations to have collective actions and to be out there fighting for their beliefs. When one example that I want to lift up of when this works best, and this goes to Nancy's point about how long it takes. At AFSC, we were really instrumental in the anti-apartheid movement. We had an amazing staff member called Bill Sutherland. For 50 years, you know of Bill. He is a famed figure.
50.
50. For 50 years, he was working to promote, to put pressure on South Africa, to lead the boycott and divestment movement. He was an unofficial ambassador for the United States, often working for American Friends Service Committee, but he also worked for other faith movements. And he spent half of his year in South Africa, half of the year in the United States. He linked the African movement to the African American movement, so he brought Martin Luther King Jr. to Africa and built those relationships. He spoke, he brought the voices of South Africa to the United States. He protested, he witnessed, he published, he kept at it for 50 years, and this was through the auspices of AFSC. And that was a success. I was in Cape Town this past summer and met with Desmond Tutu, and Desmond Tutu said, Bill Sutherland is an example of the power and the potential for one individual to lead a collective movement. So this is the foundation of American Friends Service Committee. Today, we work, so we're about 100 years old. We work in 56 locations, and we have the same goal: to speak out, speak truth to power, speak out against oppression when we see it, to transform systems of oppression, and to seek social change. Now, just to go back to the how these all work together, so we have our 3 core methods of working. And you can bet in all of our 56 locations, every time we have a program initiative, we have a long-term strategy, and we're looking at which approach, which method should we use. Sometimes we use all 3, sometimes we prioritize 1 or 2. There's always a tension, and there always is a debate about which one to prioritize. But we know, based on our example of Bill Sutherland and our work in conflict zones for hundreds of years, 100 years for AFSC and hundreds of years for Quakers, that when they work together and you could figure out a way to bring those communities together, you're going to have the most success. You're going to have a sustainable and effective movement. So thanks to Maria for proving our point.
And
Kerri, the data. Yeah.
Kerri, just before we move to Manal,
Yeah.
I mean, one of our online members, Krypton, has weighed in with, he makes the point,
From Tanzania.
From Tanzania,
Yeah.
he makes the point that he sees peace building and civil resistance as sequential, and that you should do peace building, such as negotiation, first, and then use civil resistance strategies only if the peace building doesn't work. And he believes, and he cites Tanzania, that this prevents nonviolent practitioners from risking repression or arrest. I heard you say something different.
I think in every situation, in every context, you have to come up with a strategy that works. This leads us to, I'll go to another example, but I do think that often they're happening at the same time. If we look at Egypt as an example, a lot of people point to Egypt as an example of a quick social movement. You know, you had under a month, a power has been transitioned, and I would say that it's never that simple. There's always years and decades of power building, of small groups that are doing some small actions that are building the energy and the will for some kind of large movement. So but I would say, as a Quaker organization, if you can dialogue first to find the solution, absolutely dialogue. If you can do that if that works as a strategy, that would be the best tack to take. If that doesn't work, and I would say it's very rare that could work on its own without some kind of mobilization of pressure. Frederick Douglass is the one that says one rarely concedes without a power without a demand. So we have to, I think that we need to be doing it simultaneously, and sometimes one method is going to be prioritized.
So like so many things, context matters.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So moving to Manal. Manal, you are, you run for USIP programs in a very troubled region right now, where we've seen an upwelling of people power, and also some of the most difficult examples of closing of civil society space. Talk to us about that.
And I think, Nancy, goes to the idea of context matters, and what I want to do is kind of give the context within the Middle East, and particularly within the Arab Spring context, because I think that really is the people power that people are turning to. And I think Arab Spring is a very misleading term. We first saw a lot of the movement in Iran in 2009. You have movements in Turkey. You have a lot of movement within Israeli civil society. So it goes way beyond the Arab world. But that time, I think, is very important. And I may be one of the last people in Washington that still sees the success of the Arab Spring. And I'll say, I'll say.
Is Manal alone?
No.
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
Good. Because I think part of the challenge with people power is we think that there's some powder, you add water and stir, and we have stability and we have democracy. It's long processes. It's really building up. And Egypt is a great example. I mean, the Kafaya movement started in 2004. It was an organized political movement to challenge Mubarak. You have several human rights, labor unions movements that started in Tunisia very early in 2000. And the question everyone had when they were traveling in the region wasn't, wasn't when people were asking, could we predict the Arab Spring? The question for decades is, how is this sustainable? How is it not exploded? And so I think people were anticipating, but yes, nobody actually predicted the spark. But I come to this work very much from a social justice lens. And so the tensions that you're talking about, peace building, and also the use of force are something that I'm consistently grappling with. And one of the things that I see kind of from a practitioner perspective and what I see on the ground a lot is people are wondering from social justice, people are wondering when they feel angry. I get this from youth a lot, but we're angry. And I think the answer is yes, you should be. Angry is okay. The challenge is angry equals violence. And so there's no other way of expression the anger other than violence. And I think that's a key tool that we try to bring. We say, okay, you can be angry, you can call for social justice, you should, but never be violent. And the statistics, this is a conversation Maria and I have been, is how we're convincing them. Because it's not just a matter of, don't be violent because of religious tradition, don't be violent because of morals, humans. It really is pragmatic. And, again, I come from a family that was entrenched in conflict. I never imagined the day would come when I would be in the squares, and I was very fortunate. I was actually in Tahrir Square in the second rendition. I was in Yemen, in Change Square when the president fled, and I was in Benghazi as Gaddafi was coming in when the NATO had decided to intervene. And so this was very live for me. It was very real. I have no doubt if we didn't intervene in NATO, there would have been a mass massacre in Benghazi. And so, you're grappling with this. How do you actually deal with choosing not to have violence? And Maria's arguments, and something that I've been talking to her when I was in Denver, is we have proof that it doesn't work. We have proof that there's a cycle, and I think that's how you begin to grapple. And I think in addition to the question of social justice, there's also the question of responsibility to protect. How do we work as an international community to provide that protection, but not necessarily have to turn to violence as our first means? What are the other tools in our toolbox? The other angle where I think is very difficult is how do you deal with the defectors, with security officials? And again, I was in Change Square in Yemen when soldiers were coming saying, we don't want to be part of this. We don't want to be part of this army that's killing our people. We don't want to be part of the police force. What do you do with them? And at the time that I was there, Change Square was very clear, you're welcome, but put your arms outside. And most people wouldn't. They would walk away. And so at one point in time, and I think this is a challenge in Syria, they had to embrace them, and then you get the blurred lines of, is this a nonviolent movement? Is it a violent movement? And once you blur those lines, it's a slippery slope. But it's very real tensions that are hard to sort.
Yeah.
Maria already mentioned intensifying the conflict, and I think we can see how that at the front lines in the question of sequencing. But what I want to bring is intensifying the conflict in transition. It's very difficult, even if you're committed to nonviolent. Once you start a constitution process, once you start the nation building, for decades we're telling people bullet over ballot box, ballot box over bullet.
We know what you meant. We know what you mean.
Yes. But my point, and maybe the Freudian slip, is that it didn't work. People did go to the ballot box, and so they're going back and saying, okay, the ballot box has failed us, elections has failed us, what else can we do? Oh, there's only violence. And we need to come up with a second answer, saying, okay, elections may fail because of timing, because of sequencing, don't give up on it, but in the interim, here are some other things. So I think we have to really provide very pragmatic answers for people who are on the ground, who really want, people, the reason why they're on the streets is they want to end to violence, they want dignity, they want better life, but they're just failing to find the other ways to make it really happen for them. And I think that's where this talk and this research is so crucial.
I'd like to come back to the transition, but before we do that, Manal and then Kerri, Maria, you may have thoughts as well. We heard Representative Lewis talk about the amount of work that Dr. King and others put into training and organizing and preparing. When you look at the movements that you experienced, Manal, in Yemen, in Egypt, what we saw happen in Syria, do you think they had that preparation? Did they have the kind of the opportunity to do the organizing that is so critical for these kinds of movements to have a chance of succeeding?
Not enough. I think that you did have, and again, if you look at the first renditions of Tahrir Square, you see where that training came into place, where Kafaya stepped in with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, they jumped in. They were not part of the Spark. I think if you really look at the Spark's labor unions were probably the people who provided the mass numbers. And I think that was where the disconnect. The nonviolent movements hadn't connected to what we call the street or the labor unions to provide the masses with those numbers. But I mean, if you look at Tahrir Square, I mean, it was, the predominant, you had a few incidences, you had challenges, but the predominant was contained, and I think it was because of the discipline of the Brotherhood and the discipline of the Kafaya movement. But not enough would be my short answer, and I think that that's one of the challenges, and again, something we've been talking about, it's a different skill sets. The skill sets to mobilize people to get to the street is a different skill set from the people who are actually manage the street, is a different skill set for those who will transition, is a different skill set for who will govern. And the Arab Spring was the same leadership with the exception of Tunisia, which really then led to a difficulty because you didn't have the diverse skill sets that were really needed to make it successful.
And Egypt, of course, has a much longer history than a place like Syria.
For sure.
In that kind of organizing.
That's correct.
But I would say, on Syria, Egypt, it's an interesting intersection because many Syrians obviously were inspired very much by Egypt and by Tunisia. But one of the lessons that perhaps they wrongly took from the Egyptian struggle and the Tunisian struggle was that this is a 25-day struggle.
Yeah. Yes.
So, you had Kafaya, and as Manal mentioned, this was a 2004 start date for this. And, the peak with the January 25 movement was in 2011, but you had this entire period of organizing, mobilizing, making mistakes, learning from mistakes. And so it was just an extended period of preparation, training, and activity that, of course, led to the ouster of Mubarak. But I think in a place like Syria, which, has the deepest security apparatus in the region with the Mukhabarat, to think that you would be able to sustain a mass mobilization, or that it would succeed in just a matter of a few weeks or a few months was just maybe the wrong message to take from Egypt and from Tunisia.
Yeah, and of course Kerri's given us the 50-year example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to move in the international community to taking the long view. It is very rarely this straight vertical line from conflict to civil resistance, peace building, some kind of transfer of power, inclusive democracy, and yet we often expect that. We say, okay, well, the movement has transferred power. There will now be democracy. There's bumps, there's challenges, even in the United States. In our founding, this is not a smooth, straight line. And we need to give people space and tools and resources to try new things, to learn, and to celebrate those small successes. I think we too often look for that big victory. This movement was a success, and we want to point to that. This is the blueprint.
And let's stay with that for a minute.
Yeah.
Maria, you showed us the data of what happens after the likelihood of staying on a peaceful journey versus relapsing back into conflict within 10 years, which is a depressing statistic as we see countries on the spin cycle of conflict. How can we think about and train and help plan for taking a successful transition that has occurred through nonviolent means to remain on a positive trajectory forward? And I'd like to also bring forward, for those of you who are watching processes in the United States, the State Department and USAID just released its quadrennial diplomacy and development review, in which the pillars that it highlights are countering violent extremism, open democratic societies, inclusive economic growth, and climate change. And they see underneath all of these priorities the imperative of accountable democratic governance. How do we connect these pieces?
So that's a great question, and it's actually, I think, a very positive development that our policy community here recognize the importance of democratic governance as underlying all of these other strategic goals. Because you think about it, it's very hard to combat violent extremism and achieve, equitable economic growth, and combat climate change without participatory governance and without engaging citizens in decisions that affect their lives. So I think, that the relevance then of the nonviolent action, nonviolent resistance approach is how can we support groups in the field, local agents of change, who are mobilizing to challenge social, political, and economic injustices in structures that are perpetuating grievances and that are making people very recruitable, let's say, for violent extremist actors. So how do we help people, address these grievances and challenge the structural iniquities and this idea of corruption? I mean, the QDDR mentions corruptions and accountability over 50 times. And I think there's a reason for that, because there's a whole body of literature out there that links corruption and protracted violence. And so if you care about, stopping these long-term violent conflicts, violent extremism, well, how do we think about addressing corruption? There are top-down institutional approaches, anti-corruption commissions and the like, or we can think about how to support civic actors engage in strategic mobilization to put pressure on corrupt individuals, institutions, and practices. And as you noted, this whole thing about nonviolent resistance is a skills-based enterprise. So there are actually things we can do to empower civic actors to help them do their mobilization and resistance better. In an attempt to challenge and reform these structures and institutions that frankly are protracting violence and providing a feeding ground for violent extremism.
Yeah. So we have a comment from one of our online members, Tori, who is commenting from Belgrade, who makes the point that studies have shown that one of the reasons many young people, especially in the West, become radicalized and decide to join extremist groups like ISIS is because they crave that sense of community and belonging. Mm-hmm. And can nonviolent social movements counter this trend by providing positive ways for young, marginalized people, to your point, Maria, to become involved with society and give them a sense of purpose and belonging? Yeah. Manal, you alluded to that.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I would unpack community, because I think it's more, people tend to, when they think community, start thinking about identity. I would say, again, going to the social justice, it's a matter of taking action. It's a matter of being heard. And I think that that's where we failed a lot of people in the West, in countries, that sense of being able to actually take action. And again, it's part of it is that anger. You're seeing this social justice. You don't know how to take action. We, as an international community who believe in nonviolence or who believe in certain core principles, have not provided tangible action that they can take yet. I think that there's those elements, and I think that that's where we're failing and the violent extremist groups are succeeding, is that they're providing them quick action, they're providing them an answer. Part of that includes a community, but I think that's more of the discipline of the action versus just the sense of community, because if you really look and unpack that sense of community, it's very rigid. It's very, some would argue, barbaric. And I don't think people are enticed by that. They're enticed by actually being able to do something and be heard on issues they care about.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add to that. The QDDR has some really positive steps and has really positive recommendations. But I think one thing that we have to stress here is that in order for it really to be successful, that goal to go beyond the nation states and to include civil society and the activist community and national and faith-based leaders has to be incorporated. I mean, I know too often we're in a room in power centers like DC talking about CVE strategy and talking about how youth are recruited in Syria without hearing from those in Syria or without hearing from those directly affected by the conflict. How do we bring in those voices, and how do we make sure that we as leaders in peace-building movements always have the voice of those most deeply affected in our minds, in our hearts, and in the solution? And I think that's a critical point.
So the QDDR, I mean, a lot of, if you package that, a lot of it is around this notion of fragility.
Right.
And fragility being both the ineffectiveness of a state in providing services to its citizens, including security, as coupled with illegitimacy in the eyes of its citizens. And so as we look at one of the principal challenges as enabling states to move or areas to move beyond fragility, to avoid a descent into conflict. How can nonviolent resistance be a critical factor in that effort? And this goes to the how do you keep countries from going into conflict over and over again? How can the skills and the tools of nonviolent civil resistance be a prominent feature of that endeavor?
Can I tell a good story here?
Please do.
Yeah, let me bring up a picture. So we've been working in Indonesia for quite some time, and in Indonesia there was a civil resistance movement that ended the regime of Suharto. And really there's a long history of activism and religious freedom. Recently, unfortunately, we're seeing a growth in some extreme religious intolerance in Indonesia. So we started working with the activist community who has been active for 40 years. So this is again going back to the long view. We try to be deeply rooted in a community, work with the people that have been doing this brave, hard work every day, day in and day out for years. So this is an example of people that are going nationwide to do these peace torch movements. And in some communities, extreme groups are closing down houses of worship. And this is happening of all faiths. It's not one faith to another. There's only a small number of faiths that are authorized to operate in Indonesia. And so we're supporting this movement to go out and to proudly say we support pluralism and to help the activist community be more visible and amplify their voice in the international community. So I just want to bring that back to say that people are doing this work every day. And I think it's up to us to connect it, to amplify it, and to do what we can, but often behind the scenes, to lift them up.
I would say the World Bank actually just hosted a couple months ago a whole session on state fragility, social accountability, and people power.
Yeah.
Because they're making the link too that engaging citizens in nonviolent mobilization to enhance state accountability, to improve their ability to provide services, is directly linked to challenging the state fragility. So some of these big organizations in town are getting the link between nonviolent resistance, nonviolent organizing, and actually state strengthening.
So interestingly, Kamara, who is making a comment from Sierra Leone, brings forward the example that in Sierra Leone, after the 1990-2002 very, very bloody conflict in Sierra Leone, that peacebuilding processes were developed and employed across the country. And in fact, some of the institutions like UNDP and UK and US partners worked with the civil resistance movement and civil society actors on the ground to carry out the truth and reconciliation process in Sierra Leone, which was a piece of that. I know this is something that, Manal, you and your team have taken a long look at in terms of what parts of these processes can be most successful.
And it goes to the point of, if you're committed to nonviolence, that has to happen after as well. Because what you see a lot of times is there may be a nonviolent movement, and then you have a transition, and then for that, particularly for the transitional justice and accountability element, there can be a very strong desire to kind of go back to the default of, particularly death penalty, holding trials without necessarily strong due process. And I think that what we've seen is countries that have skipped a truth and reconciliation, and it doesn't have to be like the Truth Commission, some type of process, some type of thing where you're dealing with the accountability, you're dealing with transitional justice. When you skip that process, and I think Iraq is a good example, where there's the temptation of saying we don't know how to handle this, it's an either really quick de-Baathification law, Libya did the same mistake of an isolation law, or they completely go to nation building without dealing with the reconciliation and the accountability. It's almost like every few years a reset button is hit, and then they have to have the same conversation over. And you've seen this for over a decade in Iraq, this temptation to move forward without really dealing with the past. And the challenge is you're not necessarily going to gain the spoilers. The spoilers will never gain, but what you lose is those people who were dedicated to you to begin with, those people who were really working for a transition in the belief that justice and accountability would take place one day. And after a decade, when they no longer see that happen, you may actually lose that group, which I would say is the majority, to more violent means who are then seeking justice and accountability. So it's a very crucial part. And unfortunately, because of the nation building process, because of our lack of long-term viewpoint, a lot of times the international community will push this because we want to see a constitution in a year. We want to see a parliament in a year. These are our indicators of success.
Elections.
Elections. It's the magic wand of legitimacy. So let's do it real quick.
Right.
And that magic bullet, a lot of times the international community actually pushes countries who may, they always will have challenges getting their public. And I think in terms of the fragility, there's a huge difference between illegitimacy and authoritarian regime and a lack of capacity. A lot of countries in transition just do not have the capacity to provide. They've inherited all of this. I mean, look at Tunisia, look at Iran, any country that you look at, they've inherited all these challenges, and so they're not going to be able to deal. And I think that's where the question of nonviolent movement comes in, because if you're having people in the streets nonviolent, it does create a tension for countries in transition who may have very good will to try and do this. The best example I can think of is in Libya. The second minister of justice in the transitional government at the time, who knows what the government is now, but at the time, was a huge human rights activist. I mean, this was a man who had really dedicated himself as a lawyer to human rights for decades under Gaddafi, under the most difficult regimes, and suddenly he was in power. And I remember him telling me, he was saying, I never thought the day would come where now I'm frustrated with my colleagues and my friends because they're just not giving me time. I don't, how am I supposed to deal with detentions and provide better services when I don't even know how many prisons exist?
Yeah.
Gaddafi had so many hidden prisons. And so that tension, I think, is where nonviolent movements can really decide, is it an advocacy where you're holding people accountable, or what I call collaborative advocacy, where you may actually have a partner, you still hold them accountable, but in ways where rather than dealing with them as the enemy. Great example is police. Like, they don't have to be the enemy. How can you work with them through our justice and security dialogue where they're being held accountable, they need reform, but they're not the enemy, they're not the face of the state that the way they were in the past.
Yeah, but fortunately there's more to nonviolent resistance than just protests and demonstrations and boycotts. So in, situations like this during, tenuous transitions, often some of the most effective nonviolent organizing is doing things like social audits and community monitoring and parallel structures and institutions. So these less confrontational but nevertheless collective action tactics that can actually, help empower these processes, vice purely being antagonistic. There's a time for antagonism,
Yes.
there's a time for pressure,
Yes.
and then there's a time for engagement. And there's that part of civil resistance that's also about engagement that gets forgotten about.
Yeah.
So I think Maria's just given a preview of the online course.
Yeah.
The kinds
Take
of
it.
skills, the tactics, the strategies that are critical for thinking through how to mount these. So I have seen a lot of heads nodding, and I know there are a lot of people in the audience who have their personal experience and expertise. So I want to open it up for questions and comments, both from our audience here at USIP as well as our online listeners. And Michael, you get the first question. Michael Lund, a longtime USIP
Hi, Michael Lund,
collaborator.
now a Senior Associate at Management Systems International. Well, thanks for this very rich and integrative and interactive conversation and focus. I was a little surprised to see in the billing for the program the juxtaposition of what was called traditional peace building, and apparently that means mediation dialogue now that I hear, versus civil resistance, particularly the nonviolent form. It seems to me that the concept of peace building has really mushroomed and in some ways become out of control, in the sense that it includes every single good thing that one can imagine or want for a society.
Although I like the image of out of control peacemaking.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, yeah, there's something to that. But let me try to bring a little more control back to it. So in addition to, the article that you wrote and this conversation has brought out several of the strategic advantages of nonviolent, very thoughtful, very well-informed, very well-prepared citizen mobilization. But I think it's equally important, if not perhaps even more important, given the enthusiasm that we sort of get into on this subject, to point out what the research literature suggests are some of the necessary conditions that make for these methods to have success and to have the long-term results of stable democracy as against the return of a authoritarian ruler or even a failed state. I think Libya fairly is called that. And some of the literature suggests things like, and these have been alluded to by several people already, a relatively non-politicized professional military, a moderate opposition set of parties that can take up the cause and do something with it after the popular uprisings, some element of economic capacity or ability to grow the economy. As Nancy mentioned, a functioning state that can actually respond, actually has the capacity to do something in response to these grievances. A regime that has what is called a selectorate, as against just the electorate, a group of elites that have a vested interest in preserving stability and have some clout within the regime, who can engage in bargaining in order to figure out what's the next step. So it's not simply a matter of promoting bottom-up approaches, but a kind of coherent, comprehensive approach to linking peacebuilding and mobilization. Has to involve top-down approaches and elite-centered approaches too. I think there's a tendency to sort of demonize the regimes, nasty dictators, and of course we've got good examples of them, but there's things that can be done before the revolution, not just during the revolution, and of course, as have been mentioned, after the revolution, that I think are as important entry points for the peacebuilding community as this particular one, as important as this is to bring out. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That was very helpful, and I know Manal was referring to that in terms of the dialogue with the police, for example. Maria, did you want to respond?
Well, just the data, so you mentioned some of these structural conditions that one would think actually are serious impediments to the emergence and success of nonviolent movements. The data actually doesn't show that. So the ones that you listed, the presence of these opposition political parties, economic capacity. So actually we tested those variables in the data set, in the NOVCO data set, Erica Chenoweth and I, and we didn't find that those factors prevented the emergence or success of movements. And so, but where I will agree with you, because structures do matter, and actually how security forces are configured, and whether they're sectarian based or broad based, that matters in terms of the likelihood of being able to co-opt them. That matters in terms of whether they're going to defect. That doesn't mean nonviolent resistance can't work, but it might mean, well, maybe we should focus on the economic elites or the, some other key pillars of support. So that part certainly matters, but I agree with you, and I think for the transition, these factors are critical. Economic development, the presence of political parties that can transform the momentum of opposition energy into a political transition. So I would agree with that, and then fundamentally, I agree with your statement about the need for a coherent peace-building approach that brings these various elements together.
Manal?
Just to exemplify, I mean, again, the transition point, I think in Egypt you had a lot of the work that took place beforehand. I mean, 2004 is just Kafaya. I can give you decades and decades of movements inside Egypt, one of the strongest civil societies in the region. They were training Iraqis and others for a very long time. So Egypt is, in terms of the prep, then they seized the moment that they could, taking on from Tunisia, and took that opportunity. But that lack of transition may have put them back decades. That inability to have the elements that you talked about in the transition phase really has led Egypt to a place where they've not only gone back to pre-revolution days, but they may have gone back to 80s, 70s in terms of their civil liberties and their relationship with the government. And so I think that's why that planning and that skill set, and I keep pointing to Maria because we're saying, how do we do this? How do we actually get where you get that momentum and that movement, but then you take that, that responsibility and shift it to the new group, because I don't think that you can have the same people leading each of the phases. It's what I think is really making the Arab Spring unfold, is that you had those same leaderships who just, no one has that depth of skill sets. You need to be able to push it to the next group, to the next team.
Well, and I think, Michael, a lot of your conditions really relate to that sense of capacity and what happens when you're trying to effect a transition in a place like Central African Republic, for example, where there's just no capacity, very, very little capacity, and then it becomes a function of the international community's ability and willingness to step in as proxy capacity for some period of time.
Can I add one thought to this, too?
So
When I mentioned before the revolution, I'm talking about the autocratic regimes, authoritarian regime themselves. There's things that can be done with elites, engaging elites, constructive engagement, like was used in South Africa, that can make a big difference, rather than waiting for some sort of economic crisis to bring about.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think Kerri wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I want to add to that. So one good example of our work is we support work in Myanmar. So Myanmar is pretty well known as in the 80s they had a repressive, a violent reaction to civil resistance, and it's been a pretty closed state. It's opening up, but it's restrictive. We're supporting a foundation, and this one activist, Mint Saw, who recently won the Goldman Environmental Prize. Some of you may know it. It's very prestigious. It's a great award. He worked within this restrictive, repressive society to make a really big change. So he saw a dam being built on the Irrawaddy River. He calls the Irrawaddy River the home and the lifeblood of the Kachin people, his people. He saw this happening. He was an environmental journalist. He took pictures. He recruited art galleries to depict what could happen, what could be the impacts of this dam. They were going to bring in a Chinese developer, was planning a 6,000 megawatt hydro dam, which would have displaced 18,000 Kachin people. It would have flooded its heartland, and it would have caused impacts for millions of people. So he very bravely used arts, used photography, and mobilized a national movement. And he did this quietly, and he worked within the space that was allowed. Still bravely, but not what you might think as a movement in the United States. And he changed. They also were talking to the regime at the same time they were talking to elites, and they stopped the construction of this dam. So those small steps, I think, are what's critical for radical change. And we have to celebrate those small community wins, those policy interventions, at the same time while we're dialoguing. And I think that's we hope when AFSC is at its best, that's what we're doing.
Okay, we're going to take a few more. We have some online comments.
Yeah, so we have one question from Twitter from Lee Smithy, who's a professor of sociology and peace and conflict at Swarthmore. And he asked the panelists, do you see any implications of violent versus nonviolent struggle for the post-conflict peace building? So he supposes that it makes a big difference, but he wants to know what you all think.
Yeah, so that's where the data comes in about actually the violent resistance campaigns that succeed generally do not usher in democratic countries or democratic consolidation, and there's a pretty high chance that these countries will go back into civil war within 10 years at the end. So, so there definitely is a link between how people fight and the type of society that follows, for sure.
Yeah.
And I would just say, anecdotally, again, from the countries that I've mentioned, you saw a real grapple of understanding power and leadership is through force. And so it was almost a demand from the people. So in the transition, my favorite example is Egypt. The first Ministry of Interior after the transition was so collaborative and so cooperative and met with the civil society almost weekly that he became known among the people as the romantic minister, romancy. Right? And they wanted someone stronger. How is our Minister of Interior so nice? How can he deal with security? And so they ended up transitioning him to a much harsher, and then those same people were saying, oh, please bring back the romancy. Like, we regret that comment. And so, like, it is this battle. Like, the people themselves, for such a long time, under authoritarian regime, the psychological and traumatic experience has taught them that force and leadership are the same. It's the same thing as anger and violence. And I think that that's really the challenge, and one of the things that when we're talking about nation building or construction, we don't realize how much we have to deconstruct before we can build. And I think that's a big challenge we're facing in terms of the transition governments.
Yeah, we would have the same thing. We have to focus on reconciliation, and we have to look at alternatives to violence. So we have to debunk the myth that a violent movement or a violent intervention is quick and that it's fast and it's effective. And we have to say it's messy and there's long-term repercussions. There's healing within a community that has to happen for you to have sustainable peace if violence was used as a tool for change.
Yeah, USIP has been in Afghanistan for about a decade. And when I was there recently, I met with a group of university students and a young woman who's studying law, which is an important evolution by itself, noted that her country has been at war for 36 years, and that violence has permeated every aspect of society, and they need the kind of skills building that helps the smallest of conflict be resolved peacefully, because right now the default is to violence, that when you have grown up in that kind of environment. Yeah. So let's take a few questions. We have a lot of people, so I'm going to take 3 in a row. 1, 2, and 3. but we need our microphones. So this gentleman, yep, right here. And then give the second microphone over to this gentleman. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This is to all of you, but possibly directly to you, Manal. I'm curious what the wide public perception of the philosophy of nonviolence is around the world. I have some idea what it is here in the USA, and not necessarily so great. I think there's a lot of backlash to the idea, but I'd love to know what it's like, not among activists, not among people who are involved, but is it taught in schools? Are there public figures who are popular? Thank you.
That's a nice softball question for the online course, but we're going to second.
Yeah. So my name is Eli McCarthy at Georgetown University. My question is about Gandhi used to make this claim that there was an obstructive program and a constructive program to nonviolence. So the obstructive was like boycott, strikes, non-cooperation, right? Constructive was more social uplift, particularly the poor and the marginalized, and kind of building unity. One of the things he said was when violence would become part of the nonviolent resistance, when it got to a certain point, that he would call off the nonviolent resistance movement and lean them towards more constructive program activity. So I guess I'm wondering, based on your experience, what you think of that sort of approach, because it seems to have a lot of relevance for what we've been seeing recently.
Okay, we'll take one more right here.
Hi, I'm Marion. I'm transitioning to do a master's in Georgetown, but I was previously in northern Iraq working a lot on this stuff. And I'm going to pose a question that a lot of the youth are posing to us there. So we have a lot of Arabs and Kurds, Sunni, Shia, and I was working within a university, but setting up a think tank with a lot of students. And their question, they want to do nonviolent resistance work, but they feel like the nature of the conflicts in the Middle East has made the traditional methods almost impossible. They say the fact that the biggest threats are non-state actors, that we are so divided by sectarianism, by tribalism, separatist movements. We don't even know who to be angry at anymore because there's so many, we're proxies for other countries. So how do we, what would you answer to one of these Arab or Kurdish students who say, who do we shout out to, and who do we shout the truth to and try to bring change? What do we do?
All great questions. Manal, do you want to start us off?
Sure. One is, I'll start backwards. So the question in terms of youth, and I feel I need to give a shout out to our youth program, Generation Change Fellows, who are flocking to your class because they're so eager for that answer. I'm getting that question all the time. And this is from Uganda to Nigeria to Morocco to Jordan. I mean, just these youth saying, we really want to believe you. We're just not sure that it's going to affect change, and we really need change. And I think that it's a real hard question. I would say because of the elements you described, it's more important than ever. What I've learned myself, again, I tend to be a social justice person. I believe that there are times when you need intervention, and that can look like different forms. But what I've seen just pragmatically is that the nonviolent means is the most sustainable and lead to real change. I grew up in a family, like I said, of conflict, and from a very young age, I was told, don't feel comfortable. This is South Carolina. Your job is to get back to Palestine. That is your job by all means necessary to find your way home. And everyone was always giving me violent ways of doing that. And I realized it's just not working. More and more deaths. And that's kind of pushed me from a very young age, like when I was in high school, to say, what else? And I think that's what everyone they're asking that question, what else? I know what my job is, but I want to find a real way of doing that. And I think that the element of breaking down sectarianism, breaking down this, one of the things that I've learned is that I am really a global citizen, that there is no real boundary to put me in, and that if I bring in those values, then I can help Palestine and help South Carolina all in one. And so I think that type of messaging to youth can be very empowering, but you've got to give them the tools. It can't just be a philosophy. And this is where your data is so important. This is where the experiences you're talking about in Indonesia is invaluable for me, that I'm actually going and we're sharing this with Generation Change, with our facilitators in the region. We're saying this isn't just a philosophy and theory. Here are the numbers. Here are the examples of where it's worked. And that's where I think is very empowering. And it ties a little bit to your question about the issue of nonviolence. There's a real desire to believe. There's a thirst to believe, but it's still seen as idealistic. It's the one word that I'm often described when I travel is, "You're so cute, it's so idealistic." Right? You know, and they want to kind of like pat me on the head, like, "We want to believe you." And these are top.
I think that's the heart of your question.
Yes.
I've sat with top religious leaders. I mean, you know, the absolute highest in the region, with top tribal leaders, and they will tell me. I remember in Libya, some of them saying, "We want to believe you." Now, the good news is, after there's always been challenges in terms of implementing kind of the straight, hardcore, you know, security, constitution procedures. And this literally has happened. Well, they would say, "Where was that girl who kept talking about reconciliation? Let's bring her back." And that is how I became a member of the Libya stabilization team. I was the only non-Libyan, the only international actor that was part of the Libya stabilization team, because in Benghazi, I kept pushing them and saying, "You think this is easy. Once you transition, remember this, this, and this." And they came back and said, "You know, bring that girl back. Let's hear what she had to say."
Yeah.
And so I think that there are people who want to hear it, but if you're not providing the data and the examples, it will continue to fall flat. I would say that the biggest challenge is, I would say, right, you know, one of the biggest challenges, so many challenges, but the biggest challenge is we continue to ignore the trauma. And I think that I feel it's a missing piece until we can really deal with the trauma, so that we're not, and you know, there's a great line, you know, trauma that's not transformed is transferred. And so you see this, where people who are actually fighting for liberties are then actually turning out to be the oppressors in a decade. And so I think it's a missing piece, not from a healing mental health. I think that there's great work out there, but I think we need to how to figure out, how do we deal with trauma in national dialogue? Mm-hmm. How do we deal with it when we're writing the Constitution? Because you're on a time, like you don't have 10 years for people to heal. You have to do it instantly. And I think that there are some ways that you can actually incorporate it in the pragmatic peace building. At most of these points, these sectors have been different. You have the mental healing, you have the psychological work, work on the ground, but you haven't incorporated it in actual dialogue, you know, thing to the effect that I think it could be really powerful.
And at every level, we see this in South Sudan, where the leadership reverted to the violence they know and the trauma they've experienced, and plunged their country right after independence right back into conflict and violence.
Default.
But also in terms of the youth, because it is a tough one, especially with these non-state actors. You know, what can you do with nonviolent organization, mobilization, resistance when you're in Iraq and Syria and you're facing not just obviously government regime elements, but ISIS and other. And I think, you know, there's not a tremendous amount of research done on this topic, but there is starting to be more and more on sort of strategies of nonviolent organizing, even against these non-state actors. So, you know, in places like the Philippines, in Colombia, the creation of peace zones, and even in parts of, in Mosul, in Iraq, people actually have mobilized effectively to prevent like the destruction of mosques. And in Syria and Raqqa, there have been some pretty interesting examples where women-led mobilizations, pressure against ISIS, has led to the release of some political prisoners and hostages. These are sort of in the small win category. Yeah. It's not going to effectively eliminate these elements, but there is organization and tactics you can do. And the fundamental question from a civil resistance perspective is, what are these actors relying on to stay in power? So where are their economic sources of power, moral sources of power, which is why online satire is actually super helpful in terms of challenging ISIS. So, you know, moral sources are political, economic, and what can ordinary people do to sever in an organized collective way without putting themselves at tremendous risk? So probably wouldn't be organizing, you know, street protests every day against ISIS. That may not be the best tactic. But there are lots of things people can do to sort of disengage. And it also relates to Eli's point about the constructive program, because a lot of civil resistance scholars focus on resilience. So resilience is a very big term in the literature. What can people do in cases of repression? And here we're talking about state repression, non-state repression, just to survive and to almost detach from systems of oppression. So whether it's creating underground trauma centers, education centers, schools, medical facilities, just to keep those social bonds strengthening, people organize in a way. This, in many places where it's profound repression and all of these armed actors, it may be the most effective form of nonviolent organizing and collective action that there is.
Yeah, I would add to that we would need, if I just want to show this picture, that we need to connect the different groups. So I think this is a picture of Palestine. So we're working in Israel and Palestine with nonviolent movements. And one thing that we try to do with our dialogue and exchange program is link people that are doing very small acts of peace within Syria, like doing trying to be a journalist, keeping a bakery open, 2 people in Somalia that are doing similar work, 2 people in Palestine, so they can learn from each other and be inspired. I think we do have to go back to the international community needs to emphasize the allocation of resources to a serious investment in peace. So we can't say that we can't always look at the militarized framework as the only one that is right and that is valid. And it's on us, the people that are in the field, to come up with those alternatives and to put them out there and to speak about them as loudly as possible so that they are taken seriously. And I think that's one piece that we're lacking right now. And the more that we can connect with the people that are in the communities doing this fight every single day, because it's happening. Even if people are disenfranchised, even if they're not organized, you can bet in every single oppressed community, somebody is organizing on some small scale. And how do we help to amplify those efforts?
It's very much connected to this long game concept and the resilience required at a personal level to maintain the long game. I know we have a lot of questions. Sorry, let's go over to this side and start in the back. Yes?
Hi, my name is Lindora Diawara. I'm from Liberia, but I'm here doing my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame, and I just started my internship at the World Bank. In Liberia, in terms of my experience, I did work with the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, where we did protest against the war. And based on my own experience, and now I'm now doing a research on Colombia, and I see that it's quite complex, where we see that civil resistance or civil disorder has been violent over so many years. There has been so many different peace talks, and sometimes it's like you don't know where things are heading. What would you say are the prospects for peace building and nonviolence campaign generally when it comes to Colombia? Thank you.
I don't specifically have expertise in Colombia, but I want to say I've spent many years in Liberia, and the women of Liberia are, to me, a good example of how women that formed the backbone of a civil resistance movement then made a difference in an election, and then were integrated in the infrastructure and the design of the country. So you saw the Truth and Reconciliation bring in a gender unit. You saw rape being criminalized and coming up with special victims units. Now, all of these are not without its problems and its resources, but I have to say, there's a lot to learn from Liberia, and maybe we should organize some kind of tour where we bring Liberian activists to Colombia. And so this is the kind of exchange we should be looking at: what worked, what was successful, and how do we network each other.
So USIP has been working to support an inclusive peace process in Colombia for a number of years, and I invite you to visit our website to look at a lot of the writings, and we can connect you with Ginny Bouvier here at our institute. One of the key pieces is having an inclusive peace process. Right. And so the effort has been to how do you bring into that dialogue the women, some of the civil society actors, and ensure that they are at the table as the peace is being negotiated. It is complicated, but that is one of the lessons that I think we've learned, not just from Liberia, but from a number of places.
There's actually data out there now, empirical data, that shows that the inclusion of civil society in peace process dramatically increases their success rate. And I can't, Desiree Roberts, I think is her name.
Excellent. Okay, a few more.
So we have one more from the online course. Marlo from the Netherlands. She says, in our world today, are people becoming less and less willing to buy into the authoritarian bargain? And I read that as being sort of the willingness to give up certain aspects of democracy in exchange for maybe stability or security. Or does she says, or are we seeing a growing discontent as many governments seem to struggle with providing that basic security or safety?
I think this goes to the heart of the fragility, the legitimacy, and effectiveness, because it's part of a state's responsibility to provide security, but in a way that is also legitimate in the eyes of its citizens. Panel comments?
I would say it depends on the context. When it works, it works. And so, you have several monarchies in the regime where people are, pretty loyal. You have the other people who don't have a long-term lens, who feel, they miss some of the days of the authoritarian regime, they crave the stability. So it really depends. I think it depends on kind of the context and thing. I wouldn't say people are completely ready to give up the social contract in terms of you provide this and then we'll provide the citizenship rights. I do think that what we're seeing, rather than the form of government, is really a challenge to what states could look like. I think that's being challenged. I think that what else is being challenged is, what does citizenship mean, the definition of citizenship, which then is entrenched in the questions of identity, which is a little bit what you were talking about, all the different tribal and religious, sectarian, which has begun to emerge. So I think that rather than kind of what government could look like, it is now a stronger burden of proof on state to show that they need to exist. Do you actually need states? Do you need borders? Islamic State has kind of thrown out the idea of borders, like we can just declare, this is a Western concept, we can actually declare the territory we want. So I think that's more at question, is what would states look like? How can they show that they're actually valuable? And then what is the new concept of citizenship and how tied is it to identity?
Okay, back over to this side. We'll go to the very back. And we're starting to run out of time, so we're going to try to keep it short so people can get their voices in.
Okay, thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation. This one of the main points that I heard here was about the integration of these processes and practices, which to me seems to make good sense, and it's a direction that we've been moving in for quite some time, and comprehensive is difficult to bring to reality and make real, but also really important between different practices. I want to ask you a question on the other side of the coin. Do you, because I think we can learn from the tensions, do you see tensions in the way that people who are working professionally and also on the ground, who are coming more from a civil resistance perspective, and those that are doing these other forms of peace-building work, do you see tensions in the professional cultures, in the methodologies, in the way people do it? And what do you think we can learn from those tensions in terms of maybe having productive conversations? And just as a kind of sub-question, personal interest, I'm interested also in relation to institutions of power. So some are directly challenging authority, and others are needing to work in more integrated frameworks with donor governments and others. So there's some difference there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, let's do another question. Where do right there, this gentleman in the middle, right? Yeah. Sorry, I don't know names.
John Rothenberg. Hi. I'm an Afghanistan specialist. In Afghanistan and in other places that I look at, the violent groups systematically destroy traditional means of conflict resolution, such as the shuras. I've seen programs like the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, where they try to reestablish those kind of mechanisms, and I've seen other programs that are based more on newer ideas. I think there's positives in both. I was wondering what you up there think about it.
About traditional forms of mediation and okay, a couple of quick.
I can say quickly on the Arthur, about the professional sort of different cultures. Yes, I think there are some tensions in approach. I think sometimes maybe civil resistance people will be very focused on the social justice lens and very focused on how can we be in conflicts where there are profound power asymmetries. Why are we relying on tools purely of dialogue and purely of it's important, but the mobilization to change the power structure has to happen so the dialogue can be meaningful. So sometimes there's a lack of appreciation too for the role of like intra-group communication and facilitation in nonviolent movements, because it's hard to have a strategic plan that you execute effectively if you can't talk to your movement members, which is often a problem in nonviolent movements. So I feel like we would learn a lot from each other, but there is sometimes the peace justice sort of thing that comes out a little bit, but I think we need to, move on. Afghanistan, yeah, NSP is probably one of the most amazing programs that I know of, the National Solidarity Program, because it was like very deeply rooted in local communities. In a way, it's kind of like the constructive program. These are sort of parallel structures and institutions, but connected to the government, because, you know, the MRRD ministry sort of supports the National Solidarity Program. So it's an interesting case of, like, you know, collective grassroots activity service provision being linked to the national government. So I'm a fan, at least, of that program.
And
I'll just add to the peace building point. This is the bane of my existence. Like how do these pieces fit together? Because we do all of it. We do dialogue, we do peace building, we do civil resistance, and different people have different backgrounds, different schools of thought, and they have different priorities. And we operationalize, so we have to be careful what we say. Are we going to risk people's lives? When we do some kind of advocacy here, you have to really balance that carefully and have a long-term strategy. But I have to say, with the QDDR and more integration between peace-building communities, the diplomacy conversations, democracy conversations, and development, we're seeing changes. And I think as years go on and as we have conversations like this, I feel very positive about the direction of the integration of these two schools of thought.
I'll jump into the informal because I think the first question was dealt with thoroughly. In terms of the informal, I think it's absolutely essential. It's very important. I think about the work that I did in Yemen way before, you know, the change in terms of Hadramaut and stuff. I had to know the tribal rules. I had to know the religious rules. Right now in Iraq, we're part of an intervention on the Spiker massacre. We're using tribal law and religious law. We're not using, you know, international law. It just won't have the traction and the ability to resonate the way that, you know, instantly we need. I would say there are two pitfalls to be careful of. One is when you start turning to informal justice systems, that tends to forget women and it tends to forget youth. So you need to finesse it so you're integrating that part and making it inclusive, and there's more than enough ways within religious and tribal law to do that. So you're still using that legal system, but you have to push forward for those two elements, otherwise they'll get left behind. And the other pitfall is you want to be careful because eventually you do want a rule of law system and you want some centralized legal system, and so you don't want to elevate tribal and religious law where you're making it impossible then to enter real rule of law down, not real, but more systematic rule of law down the line. On violent groups, I just feel the need to say a lot of times they start with good intentions. I watched Libya very carefully, where very well-intentioned youth picked up arms to protect their neighborhoods. They were neighborhood watches. They had no intention of getting in either side of the conflict. They had no intention of getting pulled in. Eventually, those same youth became militias. And I saw it very painfully transform into militias, despite the good intentions of where it started out from. I would say we're seeing this in the camps. A lot of people are picking arms just to protect their communities in camps. They don't intend to be involved in the conflict. If we don't do preventative means, those young people will become part of the conflict, and it'll make it far worse, particularly in Syria and Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, all that region, if we're not really engaging in prevention and finding other ways for these youth to protect themselves and be involved without having to pick up the arms.
Of course, we have our own anti-war example here in the United States in the 60s that started peaceful and became violent. So the stories are global. Last round of questions. So I'm going to take 3 and very short. Okay, this gentleman and then that gentleman. Where are our mics? And then you'll be the last questioner. So up here, mic number 1. And then mic number 2. Mic number 2. Where's our second questioner here in the...
Thank you very much for this. My name is Ami Tigros. I'm from Brandeis University in Boston. So I wanted to ask very briefly, I guess, with regards to your research. I'm sure in your long-form research that it was, there's a lot of disaggregating, looking at where it's more effective, where civil resistance is more effective regionally, nationally, and types of conflict. Whether it's a
I'm going to push you to be short.
Yeah. So I want to know if your research shows what specific tactics have been working for specific types of conflicts, what specific types of civil resistance, and then for the both of you, how do you then communicate that to the people who are there, like really, the people who are doing the actual civil resistance? How do you get them to know that?
Great, thank you, sir. And then if you could bring the mic over to...
Hello, my name is Abdul, and my question is, pardon me to be the devil's advocate here, but anyways, bear with me. My question is specifically to Ms. Omar. when civil resistance movements happen and they function on the assumption that there is some level of reception, rational reception within the oppressor, that there is possibly some pigment of it at least. But what happens when civil resistance is pitted against psychopathic regimes who, for example, the one in Iraq under Saddam Hussein with the secret police, or within ISIS? I mean, if one is to think of it, talking about pluralism in Mosul might not be a very good idea at this point in terms of civil resistance. And I ask this from a very personal standpoint. I come from Kashmir, the Indian administered part of Kashmir, and I have grown up viewing civil resistance movement. 15 minutes from my house, 5,000 people assemble. But what happens when there is systematic thwarting and obliteration of dissent? 3 Kashmiri students were slapped with sedition charges in a mainstream university in India just for supporting Pakistan in a cricket match. Mm-hmm. And I just want to ask this in a nutshell now, do you see this as a serious shortcoming of civil resistance movements? That it only occurs in certain environments and could have exceptions in some? Thank you.
Great, thank you. That is probably worth a very long conversation, but final question.
Or I kind of guess with the American Friends Service Committee, I'm grateful for Kerri's words. So I think we've found, as Kerri said, the data that folks like Maria have brought to the conversation really helpful in supporting what we know. But another piece of the puzzle is not just what the facts show, but what the feelings are. And so we've been looking at narrative and what supports this narrative that violence works, that that military solutions work for humanitarian intervention, that military solutions work, that violence works for community conflicts, and how we can bring about narrative change that actually gels with those facts of what we see works. So how do each of you see that role of narrative as a sort of long-term effort to shift the paradigm away from, oh, isn't that cute, as Manal said, isn't that nice that you like peace building?
So big questions. I'm going to ask our panelists to give your final best thoughts. They won't be complete, but wrap us up.
Narrative's incredibly powerful. The first day of training that we have for Generation Change, which is again across Africa and Middle East, is all about storytelling. That is the most powerful narrative out there. People who've experienced, almost all of them have come into contact with violence in some way or another, and how they were able to actually choose nonviolence. Sharing that story is incredibly powerful. I feel guilty when I do Generation Change programs because I feel like I'm getting recharged. I don't even know what I'm giving them. Yeah. But listening to their experiences is incredibly powerful, and it goes a little bit to communicating. It's not so much us communicating as much as it's creating and enabling an environment where they can communicate with one another and share their stories and recharge. This is exhausting, draining work, so they're able to recharge. So that's where the narratives, I think, are absolutely essential. I think, in terms of if you're fighting a regime that has no ability to reason, I would argue that you always have that. I mean, again, I come from Palestinian roots, and I see the amount. I mean, it's hard. It's the small wins, but the consciousness within Israeli civil society is incredibly strong. We don't hear about it, but it's strong, and I think that there's a real match between the two groups that most people don't envision, because you're hearing more about the direct confrontation, the conflict, and it is there. It's on the macro, and it's overwhelming. But the small wins, and again, it's more of the long term. My experience in the region, which is almost 18 years, is that conflict only breeds more conflict into the form of violence. And again, there's conflict can be healthy in terms of accountability, but it's more from a pragmatic perspective that I finally fell back and said, this isn't going to work. What are other means?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Manal.
Kerri? I would just add to that. I think that this peace building and civil resistance can work in every environment. It may take 50 years. We've been doing this work for 100 years. We have a vision for the next 100 years. But I think it's important to think of this famous quote that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. If we can take those single steps and support the people that are doing this work in Kashmir, in Colombia, in Iraq every day, if us as the external actors can put the resources, go have a long view, be willing to fail, support and amplify the voices of the people closest to the conflict, then I think we can celebrate those small steps and still have our vision of that 1,000-mile journey with the end goal of peace and justice and shared security for all.
Thank you. Great. So very quickly, tactics. Are there certain tactics working in certain countries over others? So we haven't found that per se, but we know, so Erica Chenoweth is actually has created a new data set on tactical sequencing. Which sequence of tactics actually matters in terms of the outcomes of campaigns? What we did find is that alternating between methods of concentration, so protests, sit-ins, that sort of thing, and methods of dispersion that stretch a regime's repressive apparatus is super important. So alternating methods of concentration and dispersion, very, very important. I consider most dictatorships to be psychopathic in some ways. So and civil resistance has succeeded against like lots of dictators. So there's hope, even in Kashmir, I would say, but it's a question of strategy. And you're in a tough place. So a lot of the nonviolent resistance may involve working with nonviolent actors in India, in Pakistan. You may need to extend the nonviolent battlefield in that case to make it successful. But the strategy is probably more important than the psychopathology. And then storytelling, just how many people in this room have seen A Force More Powerful? Yes. How about Bringing Down a Dictator? Do you know how Orange, about Ukraine? So these films, documentary films that brought to life historical nonviolent movements that were sponsored by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which Peter Ackerman, who's in the front row, founded, have been incredibly inspirational, and people around the world have wanted to see these and sort of replicate them. So I'll end with that.
Last word from Peter Ackerman.
There's a new one out called Egypt Revolution Interrupted.
Oh, wow.
And,
Peter, have the...
There's a new movie that's just been completed called Egypt Revolution Interrupted, and basically is your story. And these might have an interest in its distribution.
Lovely. Thank you.
One other thing you might not remember is that also we did a joint venture with you before you were here on truth and reconciliation movements in a movie. Yeah, you've had that. You said
We actually showed that in Benghazi before Gaddafi fell to plant the seed. That was actually one of the things that we have confronting the truth. Yeah.
So I want to thank everybody here who's joined us at USIP, everybody who's joined us online. This is our first live discussion. We invite you to become a part of the global campus, the global community. Tune in to these kinds of conversations. They're live. They're addressing the real issues that we're addressing. U.S. Institute of Peace has a continuing commitment to bring together these communities of civil resistance, the peace-building community, working from the ground up and the top down. This is a long game. The Dalai Lama has a vision of this being the century in which we end violent conflict. So maybe this will be your last 100-year plan, Kerri. I want to thank Peter Ackerman for his continuing support and vision, and I would like to very much ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for the conversation today. For those who can stay, please join us for tea and coffee, and we can continue the conversation just outside. Thank you.